Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 9 December 2025. It is the 308th anniversary of the birth of Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who was born in Stendal, now in Saxony-Anhalt, but which was then part of the Margraviate of Brandenburg, which was in turn part of the Holy Roman Empire. A Winckelmann museum now stands in Stendal today, and now that I know about it, I'd like to go and see it. There's a remarkable portrait of Winckelmann, now known as Portrait of Johann Joachim Winckelmann against Classical Landscape, that's at the Royal Castle in Warsaw. I can't find much information about this painting, and the artist is unknown, but it shows Winckelmann in a classical setting, robed like the ancient statues he admired. But the classical landscape in the painting isn't the classical world as it was in its heyday, when it produced the art that Winckelmann admired, but rather the ruins of the classical world as they were known in Winckelmann's time. So in this one painting, we have Winckelmann as he did not appear to his contemporaries, and we have a classical landscape as it didn't appear to its ancient contemporaries, making this a painting outside time, realized only in the painterly imagination. It is, and at the same time, it isn't an idealization, and as such, it incorporates the contradictions of Winckelmann's own life. Born the son of a cobbler, he aspired to learn Latin and Greek. Born in Protestant, he converted to Catholicism to accept a position at a large library at Rome, and at Rome he encountered art treasures far beyond what he had known from the collections at Dresden that had been his point of departure in the study of ancient art. He wrote after arriving in Rome, quote, "All is naught compared with Rome. Formerly I thought that I had thoroughly studied everything, and behold, when I came hither, I perceived that I knew nothing," unquote. According to Winckelmann's own theory of aesthetics, Greek art was, in a sense, the expression of the Greek landscape, of which Winckelmann wrote, quote, "We are told that Minerva chose this land with its mild seasons above all others for the Greeks in the knowledge that it would be productive of genius," unquote. And the Greek landscape was the necessary condition of the Greek way of life that grew up in that landscape. Quote, "In Greece, where people dedicated themselves to joy and pleasure from childhood on, and where there was no such social decorum as ours to restrict the freedom of their customs, the beauty of nature could reveal itself unveiled as a great teacher of artists," unquote. But despite his admiration of ancient Greek art, he never made it to Greece itself to see the landscape. And Winckelmann was eventually murdered under strange circumstances. A man whom he had befriended in Trieste burst in on him in his hotel room, strangled him, and stabbed him 5 times. Winckelmann survived the immediate attack, but the wounds were fatal. He died later the same day, and his attacker was captured, tried, convicted, and executed by being broken on the wheel in front of the hotel where they both had been staying. This strangely violent and ugly end to a life devoted to an aesthetic ideal is a little disconcerting, one could say. Winckelmann was one of the greatest of art historians, sometimes called the father of art history. And in no small measure, he made art history what it is today, even if most art historians today would not likely agree with his aesthetic theories. His masterpiece of art history is usually identified as his Geschichte der Kunst des Alterthums, the history of art in Antiquity, which was published in 1764. But what brought him his early fame was his first pamphlet, which was printed in a run of only 50 copies in 1755 and based on his knowledge of art prior to his arrival in Rome. This was his Reflections on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Sculpture. And unlikely though it seems today, this pamphlet made a real splash at the time. There were some interesting historical circumstances that led to this early work, and one of these influences was the discovery of the Roman city of Herculaneum. Herculaneum was buried by the pyroclastic flow of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, the same eruption that buried Pompeii in volcanic ash. The eruption and aftermath of the eruption were described in some details in 2 letters by Pliny the Younger, who described the fate of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who wrote a famous work on natural history that still survives, and who died as a result of his rescue efforts during the eruption. I visited Pompeii more than 30 years ago, and walking out the Herculaneum gate of the city and along the tomb-lined street to the Villa of the Mysteries remains one of my fondest travel memories. But I didn't get to Herculaneum itself. Pompeii was a larger town and more of a working-class place. Herculaneum was a seaside resort for the wealthy, and that meant that the palatial homes of the Roman elite and public spaces were decorated with sculpture. Portions of the city had come to light earlier, before Winckelmann's time, and there were rumors of discoveries made whenever wells were dug in the area. Among the first pieces of sculpture to come to light in the early 18th century were 3 female figures, one larger than life size, known as the large Herculaneum woman, and the other 2 approximately life size, known as the small Herculaneum women, one of whom was missing her head. These Roman marbles were probably copies of earlier Greek bronzes that haven't survived. As it happens, I saw these sculptures earlier this year when I traveled to Dresden. They're on display in the sculpture collection of the Old Master Gallery, where you can see them also if you make the trip there. They had arrived in Dresden some years after their discovery, passing first through Naples and Vienna, and it was in Dresden that Winckelmann saw them. He called them Vestal Virgins, though contemporary scholarship denies this identification. Winckelmann discusses the contours of the figures and the folds of the garment, and then arrives at one of the most famous formulations of the book. Quote, "The general and most distinctive characteristics of the Greek masterpieces are, finally, a noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, both in posture and expression. Just as the depths of the sea always remain calm, however much the surface may rage, so does the expression of the figures of the Greeks reveal a great and composed soul, even in the midst of passion," unquote. This was an impression that came to be a kind of incantation, with many following Winckelmann talking about noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. But not everyone agreed with the judgment. Walter Pater, in his famous book, The Renaissance, wrote in criticism of Winckelmann, quote, "His conception of art excludes the bolder type of it which deals confidently and serenely with life, conflict, evil," unquote. But Winckelmann was quite clear in his meaning, both in the quote I previously read about a great and composed soul even in the midst of passion, and his discussion of the Laocoon group, of which he wrote, quote, "The pain is revealed in all the muscles and sinews of his body, and we ourselves can almost feel it as we observe the painful contraction of the abdomen alone without regarding the face and other parts of the body. This pain, however, expresses itself with no sign of rage in his face or his entire bearing. The physical pain and the nobility of soul are distributed with equal strength over the entire body and are, as it were, held in balance with one another," unquote. The same, I think, could be said of the head of Odysseus that survives from the fragments found at the grotto of Tiberius at Sperlonga. A perfect example of a face that remains composed in the midst of physical pain. When Lessing came to write his own book on the Laocoon group, he was writing against Winckelmann to a certain extent. Lessing opened his Laocoon, an essay upon the limits of painting and poetry, with a quote from Winckelmann. And he writes in the first chapter, quote, "We finer Europeans of a wiser posterity have, I know, more control over our lips and eyes. Courtesy and decency forbid cries and tears. Not so the Greek. He felt and feared. He expressed his pain and his grief. He was ashamed by no human weakness, yet allowed none to hold him back from the pursuit of honor or the performance of duty. Principle wrought in him what savageness and hardness developed in the barbarian. Greek heroism was like the spark hidden in the pebble, which sleeps till roused by some outside force, and takes from the stone neither clearness nor coldness. The heroism of the barbarian was a bright, devouring flame, ever raging and blackening, if not consuming, every other good quality." Unquote. For Lessing, this was a setup for his own aesthetic theory, which drew a sharp line between the visual arts and poetry. But the point here is that Winckelmann had already become a stalking horse for the next generation of critics who didn't see the imitation of ancient works as necessarily being the best way to artistic excellence. But Lessing didn't deny the greatness of the Laocoon group, only he denied a part of Winckelmann's interpretation of it. Winckelmann's argument for imitating ancient Greek art wasn't the first time in Western history that a conscious effort was made to draw upon the classical past and to present it to contemporaries as an exemplar. Charles Homer Haskins, in his book, The Renaissance of the 12th Century, which he also calls the Medieval Renaissance, details the quantity and quality of Latin poetry written during the 12th century, some of which was later mistaken during the Renaissance, I should say the Italian Renaissance, for ancient verse. This rediscovery of Latin poetry in the 12th century was primarily a literary process, as it was more or less during the Italian Renaissance, and not a movement that greatly influenced painting and sculpture. During the Renaissance, many Italian scholars made an effort to systematically seek out ancient books, and ever since that time, which happened to coincide with the invention of movable type printing, editions of ancient works have been produced. Before that, the papacy had retained many of the organizational structures of the Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire attempted to institute some of the forms of the Roman Empire in its own medieval way, and to the extent to which it understood these structures, which it did very imperfectly. In Winckelmann's time, recurring to the classical model took a primarily aesthetic and artistic turn rather than a literary or political turn, so that artists were to learn their trade by imitating the great works of art that had survived from classical antiquity. Imitation may not sound especially compelling today, but in Winckelmann's time, it was an innovation. Throughout medieval civilization, no artists north of the Alps made any effort to imitate the art of classical antiquity, with the exception of the use of Roman architectural forms and Romanesque construction. It was different south of the Alps. I once read somewhere of the pulpit at Pisa carved by Giovanni Pisano from 1302 to 1310, so just at the end of the High Middle Ages, calling it still classical or already Renaissance. And this is such a perfect expression of what it is that I've never forgotten it, though I have forgotten where I read this. But that was Italy, where artists could see ancient works of sculpture with relative ease and imitate them if they so chose. Even during the Northern Renaissance, when painters north of the Alps began to incorporate innovations from Italy like linear perspective into their work, they had no easy access to ancient models as artists, as was the case in Italy. The Last Supper, painted by Dirk Bouts, 1464 to 1467, employs a single vanishing point, but is still thoroughly medieval in conception, for example, by showing the Last Supper in a perfectly Gothic setting. No attempt is made at an authentic rendering of a scene from history. It's as though medieval artists acquired a new technology, the technology of painting in perspective, and then used that new technology for traditional ends. Ancient art was also innocent of linear perspective, but a freestanding statue or portrait bust never suffers from this lack of perspective. Ancient art could be said to exemplify the Protagorean maxim that man is the measure of all things. An ancient statue or a portrait bust was its own measure, and the environment conformed to its proportions and not the other way around. The surviving treasures of the ancient world are now housed in museums across Europe, like the museums of Dresden, where both Winckelmann and I saw the Herculaneum women. And if you visit these museums, it's entirely possible that you'll see young artists sketching ancient statues or even early modern paintings. And in doing so, they are realizing the ideal that Winckelmann had formulated when he said, quote, "The only way for us to become great, or if this is possible, inimitable, is to imitate the ancients," unquote. I see Winckelmann as part of the growth of historical consciousness that I've discussed in several episodes. Scientific cosmology, geology, and biology have extended our historical consciousness into the deep past, and I've discussed this in my episodes on big history, for example. Futurism and speculation have, on the other hand, extended our historical consciousness into the deep future, and science has contributed to this as well. And I've discussed this in my episodes on Hermann Kahn and Sputnik, among others. Both of these expansions of historical consciousness into the past and into the future have changed the way we understand history, and so they've changed the way that we understand ourselves. But the growth of historical consciousness is always the growth of a particular kind of historical consciousness. Each time we dip into the past, we come back with something a little different. And each time we project ourselves into the future, we project something a little bit different. Winckelmann dipped into classical statuary and presented his 18th century audience with noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. I don't think this was a misinterpretation of classical antiquity, but I do think it was a partial and highly selective interpretation. But beyond the particular conceptions of past and future that each generation finds when it goes looking for inspiration, there's the simple fact that we do, in fact, repeatedly recur to classical antiquity, and in so doing, we implicitly acknowledge its exemplary status, which was what Winckelmann was doing when he urged artists to imitate the exemplary works of ancient Greek art. The tradition of Western civilization is defined by this recursion to classical antiquity. The fact that both medieval and modern civilization have reached back into the classical past and found something of value to relate to contemporaneous circumstances is one of the primary sources of the continuity of Western civilization. I don't say that this doesn't occur in other civilizations, but I don't know their histories at the level of detail that I know Western history, so I can't provide examples of it. We define Western civilization with the temporal parameters that we do in fact give to it based on the extent of history to which we recur in seeking models held to be normative. I'll call this past recursion. Our past recursion defines the earlier bound of the tradition of Western civilization. Of course, it's not recursion alone, because we also remember earlier civilizations such as the Sumerians and the Assyrians, but we don't remember these in the same way. We study them. We might even attempt to derive lessons of history from their experiences, but we don't recur to them as normative models. They are the prehistory of Western civilization, and so they have a place in our deep history, but they aren't part of the Western tradition or the Western identity. So it's the particular form of past recursion that defines our history, just as the particular form of our future recursion defines the destiny of Western civilization. Future recursion defines the later bound of Western civilization and time. Just as we take something a little bit different each time we dip into the past, each time we imagine our future, we imagine something a little different, being active agents in shaping and revising the direction of our history and its presumed end goal, if it has any end goal. So the present constitutes the past through past recursion, and the future through future recursion, just as the past and the future constitute the present through the same recursions. The dimensions of time are, that is to say, mutually constituting, and their mutual constitution is what we call history. Happy birthday, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, and thanks for listening.